Hello and welcome to my talk today. My name is Dr. Pamela McKINNEY and I'm a lecturer from the University of Sheffield Information School. I'm here to talk about some recent research into the information literacy of health tracking behaviours in members of 3 communities. This research was funded internally by the Information School, and the research team comprised myself, Dr. Andrew Cox and Dr. Laura Sbaffi. The results were published in the Journal of Medical Internet Research in 2019. There's a definition of self-tracking here. Essentially, it's the practice of purposefully collecting data about the self, which can then be used to inform oneself and shape behaviour. Research has found that the activity of self-tracking can give people a sense of control over their lives. They have an enhanced sense of self-knowledge, and this can be very reassuring. People find it fun to generate quantitative data about themselves and monitor it over time. Furthermore, tracking using apps and devices can motivate people to adopt healthy behaviours, such as increasing the amount of physical activity they take part in or improving their diet. People get a sense of accomplishment when they achieve their health goals. There is an increasing narrative around personal responsibility for health and the need for individuals to take a more active role in caring for themselves, and self-tracking is one way in which they can enact this responsibility. However, self-tracking is not without its issues, and sources highlight a variety of concerns. Anchor's study of self-tracking among patients with chronic conditions found that participants were reminded of the negative aspects of their condition through the activity of tracking. There were also concerns around people becoming unhealthily obsessed with their tracking behaviours. There are huge numbers of apps available through Apple and Google that claim to support healthy behaviours through tracking aspects of diet and fitness, but these are unregulated. And app developers could make all kinds of spurious claims and recommend behaviours that are not supported by medical evidence. There's no way for users to assess the accuracy of the information provided to them. Apps share information widely with third parties, and this data can be very sensitive and personal. There are many concerns that people are not aware of the extent to which this occurs. Even if they are aware, they ignore the potential risks. Studies have also found that healthcare providers are not very welcoming of patient-tracked data. They view it as unreliable because they don't think that patients are able to diligently track their data. They also think that patients are not very likely to record data that is negative about themselves. The underlying theoretical basis for this study is the model of information literacy landscapes proposed by Lloyd, who states that becoming information literate requires developing an understanding of what constitutes information in a specific setting, which could be a job, an educational context, or an activity in daily life. People interact with multiple sources of knowledge in their daily lives when they engage with physical and digital spaces and the information in them. So people develop familiarity with multiple information landscapes in their lives. There are 3 aspects to information in any given setting, which Lloyd calls modalities: the epistemic or formal information, factual information that is objective and reproducible; the social modality, which is characterised by information shared in the social setting; and the corporeal modality, characterised by physical information drawn from the body. Lloyd takes a practice perspective in her work, emphasising that information literacy is not just a set of skills and competencies, but is a situated socio-cultural practice. By investigating information literacy in this specific landscape, we can widen our understanding of the nature of this complex set of practices. Our previous qualitative research, which took place in 2015, and is published in the ASLIB Journal of Information Management. Participants took part in focus groups and interviews and reported a variety of self-tracking practices. we discovered 4 elements to information literacy in the self-tracking landscape, and these are used to frame the data collection and analysis of the current study. These 4 areas are understanding the importance of quality in data inputs. You need to put in quality data to get useful analysis. The ability to accurately interpret information provided by the apps and devices and understand the limitations of these technologies. The awareness of privacy of personal information and how this can be shared by apps to third parties. And finally, the appropriate sharing of data with others, taking into account the social norms around the sharing of tracked data. In the results section, I'll reflect on these 4 areas and how they were represented in the current study. So the research questions for the study are stated here. What do people in these 3 communities track and why? And what barriers are there to the effective and safe use of tracking do they encounter? Framing tracking behaviours with an information literacy perspective focuses on users' levels of competence in using information to meet their goals. And this contributes to an increased understanding of the way people engage with information in the health arena. I'm now going to introduce the 3 organisations that we partnered with for this study. Firstly, we worked with Parkrun, a non-profit organisation who host weekly free running events around the UK, which take place in parks and other public spaces. Parkrun focuses on inclusivity, and many people start their fitness journey with a parkrun. Secondly, we worked with the diabetes.co.uk online community, who support people with both types of diabetes, but we were particularly interested in those who have type 2 diabetes, which is a condition that can be controlled through diet and exercise. Type 2 diabetes is often diagnosed in later life and can present a range of health complications. And finally, people living with Irritable Bowel Syndrome, or IBS, being supported by the IBS Network charity. Irritable bowel syndrome is hard to define and is understood as a range of physiological factors rather than a single disease. It's a bowel disorder characterised by abdominal pain and disturbed defecation. The exact cause of IBS is unknown, but stress and diet are known to be linked to the condition. It affects more women than men. A short online questionnaire was advertised through various methods to the members of our 3 communities. We had 143 responses from Parkrunners, 140 from diabetes.co.uk, and 45 from the IBS Network. The questions focused on the use of apps and devices and motivations and reasons for engaging in self-tracking practices, and were largely quantitative, apart from one final question which invited respondents to tell us about their logging practice. We received lots of highly detailed answers to this question, and I've included some of them in the slides that follow. This table shows the age and gender of the questionnaire respondents. In common with the general profile of people with IBS, the vast majority of IBS respondents were female, but all 3 participant groups featured more female respondents than male. In common with the age profile of type 2 diabetes, the majority of the diabetes.co.uk respondents were aged over 40, although apparently this is no barrier to self-tracking using apps and devices. The majority of Parkrunners were aged 35 to 54, whereas the IBS respondents had a slightly younger age profile, with the majority aged 25 to 44. I'm now going to present the characteristics of each community, focusing first on their tracking habits and secondly on their attitudes towards tracking. There was some use of food logging apps among Parkrun respondents, but nearly as many had lapsed use of a food logging app as use one currently, and nearly 40% had never used one. Step counters such as the popular Fitbit were used every day by 58.7% of the respondents, and less than 20% had never used one. Unsurprisingly, using or experimenting with a run tracking device seems integral to the practice of running, with 90% of respondents saying they either used one every day or 2 to 3 times a week, and only one respondent reporting that they had never used one. Only 11% of respondents tracked their weight, and most commonly participants tracked their weight once a week. Compared to the other communities, Parkrunners used a greater variety of apps and devices and were the most likely to use a running app. As noted in the last slide, Parkrunners were really into their run tracking, and a lot of them were motivated to track as a way to improve their performance. We asked participants to state the level of agreement with the statement, "I matched my needs to specific features in the app when I chose it," and 60% overall agreed with this statement. We also asked if they worried about becoming obsessed with tracking, but 56% disagreed. They were the most likely to want to track their long-term trends in their data and review it. And you can see here an example quote from one participant. So the quotes here are taken from the final qualitative question where we asked respondents to tell us about their tracking practice. Under a third of diabetes respondents used a food logging app, but paper diaries were also used by a small minority to record their diet, and a similar number had used a food logging app in the past. Type 2 diabetes respondents were the most likely to track very specific aspects of their diet on a daily basis, and this is assumed to help them manage their condition. Weight tracking was widely engaged with practice, with only 6.4% never doing this. While they used step counters, devices or apps to record running were only used by a few respondents. We asked about motivations for tracking, and 75% of the diabetes respondents agreed that managing their condition was a motivating factor. They were evenly split between agree, neutral, and disagree with regard to how comfortable they felt sharing their data, indicating that further unpacking of this aspect of their practice would be a valuable follow-up. The qualitative data revealed that respondents had a sophisticated understanding of their condition and how tracking could influence the disease and health in general. There was definitely a sense that tracking provided an element of control over their condition. Although IBS there were far fewer respondents from the IBS network. However, the data was still interesting and relevant. As IBS is a condition that is influenced by diet, we had expected the proportion of active food loggers to be much higher. But while respondents had often used a food logging app at one stage, they were critical of their functionality, and we came to the conclusion that the time-consuming nature of food logging led to their use being discontinued. As noted earlier, stress is a contributing factor to IBS, so it is not surprising that respondents from this community were the most likely to track their mood. As with other communities, step counters were popular devices. The IBS respondents being more worried than members of the other two communities about becoming obsessed with tracking. We received many qualitative comments from IBS respondents that were critical of food logging apps. At the time of the research, there was no dedicated IBS app that was used by our IBS respondents, and perhaps as a result of this, they were more dynamic in their app use and willing to change apps when they felt that this could be to their advantage. Weight management was a reported motivation for tracking, and respondents from the IBS community shared their data least and reported feeling more uncomfortable with the idea of sharing data with their friends and family. I'm now going to present data related to the 4 aspects of information literacy in the self-tracking landscape derived from our previous study. Information literacy in this landscape is about making sure that data is accurately entered into the app, and this is a particular challenge for food logging apps, which often work well with pre-packaged food, but are much less easy to use when cooking for oneself, and you have to enter all the small elements of a recipe. Respondents wrote about how they had to develop their own strategies for circumventing perceived problems and inaccuracies with the app. One way to deal with these perceived issues was by becoming a data creator and entering recipes known to be accurate into the app for future use. Comments also revealed that respondents modified and adjusted data they perceived to be inaccurate and took some shortcuts for entering well-known food. A second aspect of information literacy in this landscape is about confidence in interpreting the data and analysis provided by the app. Most respondents were highly confident that they could understand the information provided to them by the app and had a critical awareness of the difference between data provided by the app developers and that provided by other users, for example, in the form of recipes. Some information provided by the apps was perceived to be questionable. For example, the way that some apps calculated the calorie offset from exercise. The qualitative data revealed a nuanced understanding of how the tracked data fit within the overall landscape of health and well-being of a particular individual. Understanding data privacy is a third aspect of information literacy, and most people were unconcerned about the potential reuse of their data by third parties, despite understanding that this was a possibility. In fact, the parkrunners in particular were more concerned with long-term access to their data rather than the extent to which it was shared without their explicit knowledge. In a previous study, participants described a trade-off. They felt that access to the free app was worth the potential sharing of their data. Geolocation identification, for example, from the running app Strava, was recognised as a particular safety issue because the app updates in real time where a user happens to be. And finally, there were marked differences in the extent to which people shared their data and with who. Activity data was freely and widely shared, often on social media, particularly through the Strava app and on running forums, whereas food and other tracked bodily data was much more rarely shared. Surprisingly, very few participants shared their data with a doctor, and we expected that more, particularly from the diabetes.co.uk, would be sharing their data with their health professional. Self-tracking is an information-intensive activity involving the user in entering data, interpreting the information outputs of a device, and managing access to the data. Effective and safe use of tracking depends on information literacy. The study showed that in 3 very different communities, apps and devices were used quite differently, and members had quite different motivations and opinions of tracking. Food logging is overwhelmingly tiresome and fraught with issues of data quality. It seems to be an activity that people adopt and discontinue more than tracking their exercise. A key difference between diet and exercise tracking is that activity tracking happens automatically. It's not something that takes time or needs much input from the user. As a result, information literacy in food tracking requires people to develop a critical understanding of how exhaustive the tracking practice needs to be in order to provide them with meaningful analysis and to achieve their goals. Who you share data with and why is quite a nuanced activity, particularly when it relates to social media. However, surprisingly, data is not shared with health professionals, even for those who have serious conditions. People generally lack awareness about the potential for their data to be sold and reused, and this could be increasingly a problem in the future if insurance companies get hold of this data and it is used to minimise someone's opportunities. And thanks very much for listening to this presentation. There are references at the end of the slide, and I look forward to seeing you at the conference.